At 1:33 a.m., the first wave lifted from the desert floor of Khuzestan province in near-perfect silence. Not the silence of nothing happening, the silence of 2,114 propellers spinning simultaneously, each one drawing current from a lithium battery pack about the size of a car engine, pushing a delta-wing airframe the color of sand through air that was still warm from the day's sun. Shaheds. The Iranian Shahed 136 and its evolved successor variants, longer-ranged, quieter, cheaper to produce, impossible to distinguish from one another on a radar scope that is simultaneously tracking 2,000 of them. They flew in waves, spaced 40 seconds apart, each wave a separate azimuth so that the defensive systems in their path could not simply orient in one direction and work down a single queue. The launch sites stretched across a 300-mile arc, mobile launch rails in open desert, semi-permanent launch complexes behind earthen berms, converted agricultural warehouses with retractable roof sections that had appeared, to satellite imagery, to be grain storage. 14 months of preparation. 2,114 airframes. All of them pointed southwest. All of them carrying warheads sized to turn a steel pressure vessel, a compressor station, a liquefaction train, or a fuel storage tank into something that burns for days. The target set was the energy infrastructure of the Arabian Gulf, specifically the Ras Laffan industrial city in Qatar, which processes 60% of the world's liquefied natural gas and serves as the beating commercial heart of a country that has based its entire foreign policy on being indispensable to the global economy. The South Pars gas field processing facilities on Iran's own coast. No, not those. Those were Iranian. The Ruwais refinery complex in Abu Dhabi, the largest in the Middle East. The liquefaction terminals at Das Island, the crude loading infrastructure at Jebel Ali, the desalination plants at Tawila and Mirfa, whose interruption would not produce economic damage but thirst, real thirst, in a country of 10 million people living in a desert that produces no natural fresh water. The IRGC's strike planners had drawn the target list with a specific logic. Not to damage the Gulf states, but to make the Gulf states ungovernable as hosts for American military power. If the lights go out in Abu Dhabi, and the water stops in Dubai, and the gas stops flowing from Ras Laffan, the argument ran, the Americans lose their welcome. The bases close. The carriers have nowhere to refuel. The logic was coherent. The premise was, again, catastrophically wrong. The Shahed swarms had been airborne for 11 minutes before the first detection arrived at the Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid. 11 minutes of flight time from the Khuzestan launch sites at the Shahed's cruising speed of roughly 115 miles per hour put them approximately 21 miles southwest of their launch points, well within Iranian airspace, low and slow, their radar cross-section small enough that they had been slipping beneath the detection threshold of the air surveillance radars that cover the Gulf's northern approaches. They were not invisible. Nothing is invisible to every sensor simultaneously. What they were was small, slow, low, and numerous in a combination that stressed the specific detection architecture that had been optimized over 20 years for the ballistic missile threat, the high-altitude, high-speed, high-radar cross-section threat, rather than for a swarm of small propeller-driven aircraft flying at 300 feet. What detected them was not a radar. It was a Space Force infrared satellite passing over the Gulf at 1:33 a.m., whose sensors had registered the simultaneous thermal bloom of 2,000 propellers, starting within a 40-second window across a 300-mile arc of desert. The signature was unmistakable in the same way that a single match struck in a dark room is unmistakable to someone watching from the ceiling. 2,000 propellers starting within 40 seconds is not a pattern that occurs in nature or commerce. The warning reached Al Udeid at 1:44 a.m. 11 minutes of Shahed flight time had elapsed. The swarm was now 33 miles southwest of its launch points. It had approximately 147 minutes of flight time remaining to the nearest target at Ras Laffan. 147 minutes is a long time. It is also a very short time when the defensive problem involves 2,114 individual airframes that need to be acquired, tracked, assigned to interceptors, and engaged before they reach populated infrastructure. The Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid had rehearsed the mass drones scenario. They had not rehearsed it at this scale. The largest previous Iranian drone attack on Gulf infrastructure had involved 212 Shahed 136 in a single night. This was 10 times that. The CAOC's Air Battle Management Team looked at the track density on their display at 1:47 a.m. when the first radar contacts began appearing on the network as the swarm descended into reliable detection altitude, and the senior director used a word that is not in the targeting manual. She said it once. Then she began working the problem. The first decision was sequencing. With 2,000-plus inbound threats and a finite magazine of interceptors distributed across the theater's ground-based air defense batteries, the Patriot PAC-2 and MIM-104F systems covering the Gulf states, and the shipboard Aegis magazines of the surface combatants in the Gulf and Gulf of Oman, the engagement could not be first come, first served. Every Shahed was not an equal threat. The ones on direct azimuths to the Ras Laffan liquefaction trains, where a warhead impact on a pressurized LNG storage vessel would produce a fire that could be visible from space, were priority 1. The ones aimed at the desalination plants were priority 2, not because water infrastructure is less strategically important than natural gas, but because desalination plants are harder to catastrophically destroy with a single Shahed warhead, and the human consequence timeline is longer. The CAOC's engagement management system, running the prioritization algorithm that had been developed and refined over 18 months of scenario planning, distributed firing assignments to the theater's ground-based and sea-based defensive systems within 90 seconds of the mass track picture becoming coherent. The Patriot batteries began engaging the leading edge of the swarm at 1:54 a.m. at ranges of approximately 25 miles from the Qatari border. The PAC-2 guidance-enhanced missiles, assigned to the Shahed-class target set, lower-cost interceptors than the PAC-3 MSE, appropriate for the lower capability target that a propeller-driven drone represents compared to a ballistic missile, began firing in ripple sequences timed to maximize coverage without burning through the magazine at a rate that would exhaust the batteries before the swarm's tail elements arrived. This was the core tactical problem. The swarm was designed to exhaust interceptor magazines. Every Shahed that was fired at, hit, or missed was consuming interceptor inventory. The engagement math was brutal and simple. If the average intercept consumed one PAC-2 gem round, and the Patriot batteries in the Gulf theater held a combined magazine of approximately 1,400 rounds, the batteries could engage 1,400 Shahed threats before going dry. The swarm had 2,114. The CAOC had anticipated this and had prepared for it with a layered response architecture that did not rely on any single system type. The Patriot batteries were the outer layer, long range, high reliability, high cost per shot. The second layer was the Emirates Air Defense's Crotal and Hawk systems, supplemented by the Qatari Sky Shield installations that had been certified for Shahed-class targets in the preceding year. The third layer was the gun systems, the CRAM counter-rocket artillery and mortar installations at each major facility, the Phalanx Block 1B systems that had been installed at the Ras Laffan facility perimeter in 2024 after the first major Iranian drone campaign, and the Centurion land-based CIWS systems at Ruwais. Beyond the gun systems, there was a fourth layer that the IRGC's drone planners had not incorporated into their magazine exhaustion mathematics: the aircraft. The F-15E Strike Eagles of the 492nd Fighter Squadron, operating from Al Udeid, had been airborne since 1:39 a.m., 5 minutes before the CAOC received the satellite warning, launched on a pre-arranged alert protocol triggered by the Space Force infrared detection. They were armed with AIM-9 X-Sidewinder air-to-air missiles, 20 per aircraft, specifically loaded for the drone intercept mission. 16 F-15S 320 AIM-9X. In the open air over the Gulf, with no terrain masking and no adversary electronic countermeasures, an F-15E engaging a Shahed 136 with an AIM-9X at optimal range is a tactical problem without meaningful uncertainty. The Shahed cannot maneuver against a missile. It cannot jam its seeker. It cannot deploy countermeasures. It is, from the perspective of an AIM-9X, an airborne metal and plastic object with a heat source at its rear, flying in a straight line at 115 miles per hour. The first F-15E made contact with the eastern edge of the swarm at 1:59 a.m. and began firing. The pilot later described the experience as unlike any combat he had trained for, not the focused intensity of an engagement against a maneuvering adversary, but the mechanical repetition of a task that needed to be performed correctly over and over again as quickly as possible for as long as the weapons held. He fired his first AIM-9X at 1:59 a.m. He fired his last at 2:14 a.m. 15 minutes, 20 missiles, 20 confirmed kills. The F/A 18F Super Hornets from the USS Harry S. Truman, operating in the Gulf of Oman, contributed 12 additional airframes to the intercept mission beginning at 2:07 a.m. The Truman's air wing had been tasked with the southern intercept corridor, the Shahed elements on azimuths toward Ruwais and the Das Island terminals. The Super Hornets carried a mix of AIM-9X and AIM-120C AMRAAM. The AMRAAM, chosen for its beyond visual range capability that allowed pilots to engage drones at distances that maximize the engagement timeline and kept the airframes outside the swarm's geometric density, where mid-air collision with an unengaged Shahed was a non-trivial risk at low altitude. The Super Hornets worked the southern corridor from 2:07 a.m. to 2:41 a.m., accumulating 206 confirmed intercepts across 12 airframes. The gun systems engaged the closest approaching elements beginning at 2:19 a.m., when the leading edge of the swarm had fought through the outer missile engagement layers, not intact, not undiminished, but still numerous, and reached the proximity belt of the infrastructure facilities. At Ras Laffan, the 4 Phalanx Block 1B systems at the facility perimeter acquired the incoming drones at ranges of approximately 3 miles and began engaging in their characteristic rapid-fire sequences, 3,000 rounds per minute of 20mm tungsten core ammunition, the system tracking its own rounds and adjusting in real time. The noise of a phalanx engaging at full rate is audible for miles, a sound that workers at the Ras Laffan facility who had been directed to shelter in the reinforced structures below grade level could hear as a continuous mechanical roar above them, punctuated by the closer, sharper detonations of Shahed airframes impacting the facility perimeter, the desert beyond it, the sea. 14 Shaheds reached the phalanx engagement envelope at Ras Laffan. 9 were intercepted by the guns. 5 were not. Of those 5, 3 detonated on the facility's outer security berms and produced fires that facility firefighting teams extinguished within 22 minutes. 2 struck processing infrastructure, 1 impacting a gas compression building's external wall, 1 striking a secondary pipeline junction. The compression building sustained significant structural damage. The pipeline junction fire burned for 6 hours before suppression was complete. Production at the affected train was suspended for 11 days. The core liquefaction infrastructure, the trains that represent hundreds of billions of dollars of investment and process the majority of the facility's throughput, was undamaged. The 5 drones that the combined air and ground defense architecture had failed to intercept had caused damage that was real, significant, and repairable. Not the catastrophic destruction of the world's largest LNG processing facility that the IRGC's planners had calculated. At Ruwais, 0 Shaheds reached the facility perimeter. The southern intercept corridor had been more effectively covered by the Super Hornet package and by the Emirate ground-based systems, which had prioritized the Ruwais approach. Azimuth, after a strategic assessment conducted in 2024, had identified it as the highest consequence single point of failure in the Gulf energy architecture. At Das Island, 3 Shaheds penetrated the defensive envelope. 2 were destroyed by CRAM in their terminal approach. 1 impacted an empty storage tank that had been taken offline for maintenance 6 days earlier. The warhead detonated. The tank was destroyed. No product was involved. The final Shahed elements, the tail of the swarm, launched in the last waves from the Khuzestan sites, were reaching their engagement envelopes at 2:47 a.m. Of the 2,114 that had launched, the post-engagement assessment would determine that 1,988 had been confirmed as neutralized or destroyed before reaching their targets. 126 had reached proximity with infrastructure. Of those, 41 had been neutralized by close-in gun systems. 85 had impacted. The damage assessment across the Gulf would take 4 days to complete. The summary, when it came, described real damage: a compression building, a pipeline junction, 2 secondary processing installations, 1 empty tank, and scattered impact craters across the perimeters of facilities that had been harder to damage than the IRGC's planning models had indicated. It did not describe the strategic paralysis of the Gulf energy economy. It did not describe the closure of American bases. The lights in Abu Dhabi were on. The water in Dubai was flowing. The gas from Ras Laffan was moving at reduced throughput from one suspended train through the pipelines that fed the world's LNG carriers. The IRGC had fired 2,114 drones and achieved approximately the strategic effect of a moderate industrial accident. They had also revealed, precisely and in detail, the location, organization, production capacity, and operational doctrine of every drone manufacturing and launch facility in the Khuzestan Arc. The response was designated Operation Silent Forge. It launched at 3:11 a.m., 87 minutes after the swarm lifted, 36 minutes after the last Shahed impacted any target in the Gulf. Not because the response required 87 minutes to prepare. The targeting package for the Iranian drone manufacturing and launch infrastructure had been compiled, validated, and loaded into weapon systems before the swarm was detected, as part of the contingency planning that had accompanied every escalation cycle of the conflict. The 87 minutes had been spent on one specific analytical task: using the Space Force infrared launch detection, the ground-based radar tracking, and the acoustic monitoring network to construct a complete and verified map of every launch rail, every pre-positioned Shahed airframe, and every support vehicle that had participated in the 2,000 drone launch. It was, in the language of the targeting analysts who completed the map at 2:58 a.m., the most comprehensively characterized strike target set they had ever worked with. The Iranians had revealed everything. The B-2 Spirit bombers had been airborne since midnight. 2 of them, launched from Whiteman Air Force Base under the cover of a routine long-duration training profile, had been holding in a classified orbit over the eastern Indian Ocean, waiting. They carried GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators and GBU-31, JDAM precision-guided munitions in their internal weapons bays. The B-2's low observable profile, its radar cross-section measured in fractions of a square meter, allowed it to operate in contested airspace without the electronic warfare escort that other platforms required. The 2 B-2s turned northwest at 3:11 a.m. and began their attack runs toward the Khuzestan facilities. They would reach their weapons release points at 4:02 a.m. The submarine-launched Tomahawks addressed the outer ring of the target set, the radar and communications infrastructure that connected the drone launch networks to their command nodes, the propellant and battery storage facilities that were too numerous and too dispersed for precision aircraft to address efficiently, the launch complex, administrative and maintenance buildings that represented the institutional knowledge and technical workforce of the drone production system. 64 Tomahawks from 3 Virginia-class submarines, launched between 3:14 a.m. and 3:21 a.m., arrived on target across the Khuzestan arc between 3:44 a.m. and 4:01 a.m. in a time-sequenced pattern designed to suppress any remaining air defense response before the B-2S reached their release points. The F-35A package from Al Udeid, 36 aircraft, launched at 3:17 a.m., addressed the mobile launch rail vehicles. The Space Force coverage had tracked every vehicle involved in the launch sequence. Some had attempted to move from their firing positions in the minutes after the last drone launched, following the displacement doctrine that the IRGC applied to all mobile systems. The tracking was continuous. The vehicles that moved were tracked to their new positions. The vehicles that did not move were tracked at their old positions. The F-35As, using their sensor fusion architecture to receive real-time position updates from the Space Force constellation through the secure data link, engaged launch vehicles in their current positions rather than their pre-launch positions. GBU-39, small diameter bombs, 4 per aircraft, 36 aircraft, 144 precision weapons, systematically addressed the vehicle target set between 3:41 a.m. and 3:58 a.m. The B-2s reached their weapons release points at 4:02 a.m. The facilities they addressed were not mobile. They were the fixed infrastructure of the Shahed production and pre-launch system, the hardened assembly buildings where Shahed airframes were stored in ready-to-launch configuration, the battery charging and maintenance facilities whose specialized equipment could not be moved, the command and coordination complexes that had managed the 2,000 drone launch and whose destruction would eliminate the institutional capacity to repeat it. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators assigned to the 2 most deeply buried command facilities arrived at their targets at 4:04 a.m. and 4:06 a.m. The seismic signatures were registered on monitoring networks in Kuwait and Bahrain. The remaining facilities were addressed by GBU-31 JDAM precision-guided bombs in a systematic sequence that the 2 B-2s completed at 4:19 a.m. Total weapons release window, 17 minutes. Total facilities addressed, 23. The B-2s turned southeast and began the long transit home. Neither aircraft had been detected by any Iranian air defense system. At 4:47 a.m., the CAOC at Al Udeid distributed the preliminary battle damage assessment. The drone manufacturing and launch infrastructure across the Khuzestan arc had been reduced, in 106 minutes of coordinated strikes, from a system capable of producing and launching thousands of Shahed airframes to a collection of damaged buildings, destroyed vehicles, and cratered launch positions whose reconstruction would require a program measured in years. The 2,114 drones that had launched at 1:33 a.m. represented a significant fraction of the total pre-positioned inventory that the IRGC had accumulated over 14 months. That inventory was gone, expended in the swarm or destroyed on the ground by Silent Forge. The production facilities that would have replenished it were gone. The vehicles that launched the swarm were gone. The command infrastructure that coordinated the launch was gone. The Gulf energy facilities were still operating, damaged in some cases, operating. In the Ras Laffan facility, workers had emerged from their shelters at 2:51 a.m. and begun the systematic survey of their installations. The compression building that had taken the direct Shahed impact was assessed within 4 hours as structurally damaged but repairable, with a restoration timeline of 11 days. The pipeline junction fire had been extinguished. The facility's core liquefaction trains, the infrastructure whose destruction would have produced the IRGC's intended strategic effect, were intact and in the process of being brought back to full throughput following the precautionary shutdown initiated at 1:44 a.m. when the swarm warning reached the facility management. The first LNG carrier resumed loading at 9:22 a.m. The IRGC had spent 14 months and an estimated $3 billion building a drone arsenal designed to shut down the Gulf energy economy and collapse the political will to host American military power. They had launched everything they had. They had achieved 11 days of reduced throughput at one LNG processing train and a collection of industrial fires that were extinguished before morning. And in exchange, they had handed the targeting analysts at Al Udeid a complete, precisely characterized map of every drone, manufacturing, storage, and launch facility in their possession. In the economy of warfare, there is no transaction more expensive than the one where you spend everything you have to buy nothing you needed.